Hey everyone, I'm Shaun Hagen, CEO of CartonCloud, and welcome back to This Week in Logistics. Each week we break down what actually matters in logistics, not just the headlines, not just the hype. We talk about what happened, why it matters to you, and what you should actually do next. So last week we talked about the absolute extreme end of supply chain risk. We talked about Navy blockades in the Strait of Hormuz, the threat of physical diesel rationing in New Zealand, and how geopolitical shockwaves turn fuel from a pricing problem into a physical supply problem. This week, we're dealing with the administrative hangover of that exact crisis, because obviously the crisis is still going, but when a massive geopolitical shock hits, the pressure doesn't just disappear the next week. It trickles down. It trickles down into your contracts, into your surcharges, and your daily operating details. The market headline might look relatively quiet this week, but the actual cost to serve and the execution risks are moving rapidly underneath you. Today, we're going to talk about how volatility is showing up entirely in the hidden cost stack. We're talking about a massive new regulatory ruling in Australia that forces fortnightly fuel adjustments. And we're looking at how service expectations are rising even as networks get more expensive to run. And as we've been talking about the last few weeks, the gap between average operators and disciplined operators is continuing to widen. So let's hit the news desk and get you caught up. So this week we have a pretty heavily fragmented but still very important news cycle. We're going to run through the top stories moving the needle. And first up, the massive regulatory shift in Australia this week directly links into last week's global fuel shocks. The Fair Work Commission has just implemented an emergency road transport contractual chain order effective the 21st of April. This legally requires businesses at the top of the supply chain to update the rates they pay to transport operators every single fortnight to account for surging diesel prices. And we're going to unpack exactly what this means for your pricing cadence in deep dive number one. In the US, Customs and Border Protection launched the phased rollout of its CAPE tariff refund process. Initial eligibility is limited, but companies may be chasing very large cash repayments. We'll also cover this in deep dive number one because success here will depend entirely on how clean your documentation is. FedEx and UPS parcel surcharges reported this week that per package ground rates in Q1 sat 39.3% above the 2018 baseline. Ground fuel surcharges were up 26.7% year over year in Q1, which actually outpaces the underlying increase in diesel. Parcel networks are getting more expensive through accessorials. Fourth up this week, C.H. Robinson's April update says cross-border markets are tightening. Strong Mexico trade is meeting higher carrier costs and regulatory pressure, while Canada is dealing with enforcement-driven capacity loss. We'll unpack why available capacity is not the same as reliable capacity in deep dive number two. UPS announced it's equipping its US hubs with RFID sensors to eliminate nearly 20 million manual scans a day. The goal is broader network visibility and better delivery reliability. This is a service expectation story disguised as a tech story, and we'll break down what that means for you in deep dive number two. And finally, on a related note, Home Depot is exploring a massive new distribution center in New York, specifically designed for same-day and next-day delivery of bulky goods like lumber and flooring. To support this, they also just acquired a warehouse tech firm, Simple Automation. We'll talk about how this raises the baseline for mid-market 3PLs in deep dive number three. Now, before we get into the heavy analysis, it's time for our weekly logistics fun fact. And one of the biggest operational launches this week was the US Customs and Border Protection's new CAPE refund process, which is designed to process millions in potential duty refunds. The funny thing is that this massive, highly anticipated federal trade rollout effectively begins with batch CSV uploads. It's a brilliant, humbling, and not so surprising reminder that even in 2026, with all the industry talk of AI, blockchain, robotics, a surprising amount of real logistics advantage still comes down to whether your data is clean enough to survive a simple spreadsheet upload. All right, from clean spreadsheets back down to your daily operations, let's get into our first deep dive. And we're going to start with what I consider the most critical operating lesson this week. Volatility is now being transmitted entirely through the hidden cost stack. Back in last week's episode, we talked about the surcharge trap, the idea that flat line haul rates or lane rates might trick you into thinking the market is stable, while margins bleed out through accessorials. And right now, that trap is shutting. Let's look at the absolute biggest news out of Australia this week, which is on the 21st of April, the Fair Work Commission activated an emergency road transport contractual chain order, specifically designed for fuel cost recovery. Because of the massive global fuel shocks we discussed over the last few weeks surrounding Middle East blockades, the government fast-tracked this regulation and legislation. The order legally requires businesses at the top of supply chains to adjust the rates they pay to transport operators every single fortnight to account for surging diesel prices. Now think about the sheer administrative friction of that ruling. If you're a 3PL, a transport buyer, or a forwarder in Australia, your carrier pass-through cadence just became fortnightly by law. Now, hopefully many of our customers have already been adjusting that on a more frequent basis, but if your pricing contracts are locked into 30-day reviews, you're legally obligated to absorb carrier rate increases every 14 days. You have a massive immediate mismatch problem, and you're going to bleed cash in every lane if you don't update your systems and processes to match that. And we're also seeing this hidden stack inflate globally. Supply Chain Dive reported this week that FedEx and UPS fuel fees are continuing to push delivery costs to record highs, severely outpacing the underlying increase in diesel itself. The lesson is consistent. If you are still only looking at the base rate, you are flying blind and you are probably going to be making bad decisions or losing money. This also extends into administration. The US CBP just launched the first phase of its duty refund process. And on the surface, while that looks like a finance story, for operators, it's a reminder that cash recovery and compliance now depend entirely on how good your records are. Admin is no longer just a back office overhead, it's a live margin lever. The second major theme this week is how service expectations are shifting around predictability and visibility, especially at the borders. C.H. Robinson's latest market update noted that cross-border conditions in North America are tightening. Strong Mexico trade is meeting higher carrier costs and regulatory pressure. In episode 4, we talked extensively about the illusion of capacity on the Mexico corridor. I said back then that just because a truck has an engine doesn't mean it has a compliant, cross-border certified driver. C.H. Robinson is confirming exactly that. When people ask, is cross-border okay right now? The answer is, for whom, on which lane, with what paperwork, and with what carrier. Available capacity is not the same as clean, reliable capacity. And that brings us to the UPS RFID announcement. UPS is expanding RFID tracking across its entire US network to eliminate nearly 20 million manual scans a day. It would be easy to call that an internal technology story and move on, but for mid-market operators, it's really a service expectation story. What UPS is doing is compressing the gap between where a parcel physically is and when the network knows about it. And that competitive advantage in logistics is no longer just delivery speed, it's event quality, it's exception visibility. Fast is good, but predictable, visible, and explainable is increasingly what customers are actually buying. If your warehouse dispatch accuracy is inconsistent or your scan compliance is patchy, you're going to struggle in SLA negotiations this year. The big carriers are raising the baseline for everyone. And finally, speaking of big players, let's talk about Home Depot, because they are proving that service expectations are not easing just because the market is volatile. In fact, they're getting tougher. Home Depot announced it's exploring a massive new distribution site in New York, specifically to support same-day and next-day delivery of bulky goods. We're not talking about lightweight e-commerce parcels, we're talking about lumber, flooring, and heavy building materials, the exact type of freight that historically gave 3PLs a bit more room on delivery expectations. And that room is rapidly getting smaller as the expectations between B2B and B2C receiver experience converge. Almost at the exact same time, Home Depot acquired Simple Automation to achieve faster cycle times and fewer product touches. Now, back in episode 5, we talked about DHL abandoning massive multi-year IT projects in favor of boring automation, fast, plug-and-play tech that solves a specific constraint. Home Depot is doing exactly the same thing here. Large shippers aren't just promising faster service, they're buying physical and digital infrastructure to make faster service repeatable. And that matters for everyone in the market because big operators inevitably reset customer expectations for the smaller operators. And even if you're not trying to copy Home Depot's network, your customers are being trained by them. They start to think next day for awkward, bulky, ugly freight, and they start to think that that's reasonable and the norm. If the market is telling you that customers want faster, more visible service, the answer isn't to blindly promise everything. The answer is to get incredibly precise about what you can do well, where you can do it, and how you communicate when conditions change. So where does all this leave the operator playbook for the next 7 days? Well, here are your 3 practical actions. 1, audit your surcharge exposure and cadence. If you operate in Australia, you need to review the Fair Work Commission's new fortnightly order immediately. But globally, if your pricing review cadence is slower than your cost pass-through cadence, you're subsidizing your customers' freight with your own cash flow. Stop falling into the surcharge trap. 2, clean up your admin infrastructure. Customs documentation, invoice controls, status event quality. Treat this week's CBP refund launch as a wake-up call. If your data can't survive a clean CSV upload, you're leaving margin on the table. And number 3, redesign for selective reliability. Pick the customers, services, and lanes where you can become consistently excellent and protect those first. In a volatile market where bulky freight is moving to next day and borders are tightening, disciplined selectivity is always better than broad overcommitment. For your watch list next week, I'll be watching whether the CBP refund workflow creates real cash movement or just administrative friction. I'll also be watching whether parcel surcharge pressure keeps climbing, and I'll be watching how closely the Australian market digests this new fortnightly fuel reporting requirement. I'm Shaun Hagen. This has been This Week in Logistics. Spot the pattern early, simplify your response, and keep your pricing tight. I'll see you all next week.